Okay. Now, finally, we go to the audit sampling and substantive test. So, in audit sampling and substantive test, the procedure is very similar in test of control. But of course, we have a different objective here, and we have different in certain areas or process also. Okay, but the logical approach would be similar, wherein we determine the objective, identify our sampling plan, execute our sampling plan, and evaluate no, the result of our sampling procedures. And let us discuss first the sampling risk in substantive test. So remember, in test of control, we have assessing control risk too high and assessing control risk too low. The more important of which is assessing control risk too low. Okay? So here in substantive test, we have risk of incorrect rejection. So risk of incorrect rejection is the conclusion that the item is materially misstated. We think it's misstated or incorrect, but actually it is not. So therefore, our tendency is to test more items. So this is similar to assessing control risk too high. Okay? In this case, it will affect audit efficiency. So because in trying to prove that the item is misstated, you will have to test more items. Okay? So you reject the acceptability of the item. That is why you need to test more. But at the end of the day, you will found out that the item is not misstated. So based on the more items that you have tested, you cannot find additional misstatements anymore. So that's why it's called incorrect rejection. So the opposite is the risk of incorrect acceptance. You conclude that the item is not materially misstated when in fact it is actually materially misstated. So for example, you tested few items and then you decided that okay, this account is not materially misstated. But in reality, there are misstatements in that account, which you will not be able to find because you already accepted that based on the few samples that you have tested, the account is not materially misstated. So this will affect audit effectiveness. It could result to incorrect opinion or incorrect conclusion. So that is why risk of incorrect acceptance is more dangerous compared to risk of incorrect rejection. Okay? So that is why when designing our sampling plan, this is the one that we consider. So we use this in our parameter, the risk of incorrect acceptance. So if in TOC we have attribute sampling, in substantive test, we have what we call variable sampling. So we use this in our substantive test procedures applied to test of details only. So because again, no, we do not test the details, the documents, the audit trails in substantive analytical procedures. In variable sampling, we reach conclusion in terms of peso amount instead of rate of occurrence. So remember in attribute sampling, we reach our conclusion in terms of rate of occurrence. Here, we reach a conclusion in terms of peso amount. And finally, materiality threshold apply. Okay, so the amount of materiality that we have set in our previous discussion apply here in variable sampling. So our steps in variable sampling, so very similar as I mentioned to attribute sampling. So first, we determine the objective. So here the objective, instead of whether the control is working or operating effectively, so this time our objective is whether the account balance or the class of transaction or the disclosures are fairly presented. So the amount are fairly presented. So define fair presentation and material misstatement. So for example, fair presentation is when the amount is stated in accordance with GAAP or PFRS. And material misstatement if there is a difference between the amount expected by the auditor and the amount actually presented by client. Now, for example, the receivable expected by the auditor is 100,000 based on the audit procedures that the auditor performed, but the client presented 150,000, so there is a misstatement, the difference of the two amounts. So we define the population, the total receivables, the total sales, so depending on the test that we are doing. So we determine the method of selecting samples, so random selection method, systematic selection method, haphazard, block sampling, so PPS, probability proportional to size. So those are the sample selection method that we can consider in variable sampling. Then we determine the sample size again using the sample size table. So in TOC, we also have a similar one here in substantive test. So we just have to know the parameters. So here are the parameters that we consider in variable sampling. So if there is an increase in assessment of inherent and control risk, increase in risk, then it will result to increase in sample size. Okay? So if there is an increase in use of alternative audit procedure, it will decrease the sample size. So because you have another way of supporting your objective. So increase in tolerable misstatement. So this is your materiality. It will decrease the sample size. Lower materiality, it will increase your procedure and therefore increase your sample size. So the expected misstatement, direct yung effect. So similar to risk, increase in expected misstatement, increase in sample size. So lower yung misstatement na expected, lower din yung sample size. So sa tolerable misstatement, inverse yung relationship. So increase in auditors required confidence level or decrease in risk of incorrect acceptance. So if we decrease the risk of incorrect acceptance, we lower the sampling risk. So that means we need more certainty and therefore increase yung sample size. So finally, the number of sampling units in population, assuming a large sample size, no effect in our sample size. So because we have a fixed sample size, so depending on the parameters that we have chosen here. Okay? Now, one difference of variable sampling and attribute sampling, in variable sampling, there is a need to project the errors in substantive test, the misstatement. So the errors in substantive test are the misstatements. So this is necessary before we compare the misstatements that we have noted in sample results with our materiality. Okay, so kasi let's say for example, our materiality is let's say the materiality in auditing receivable, let's say is 20,000. Okay, and then we audited the receivable. The total amount of receivable is 1 million. Then out of 1 million, we tested 100,000 worth of receivable only, and from which we found 5,000 pesos worth of misstatement. So if you compare 5,000 misstatement based on the materiality of 20,000, it will appear that it's immaterial because 5,000 is lower than the 20,000 materiality. But the reason why the misstatement is so small because we haven't tested all the receivable. Only 100,000 out of 1 million pesos receivables were tested. So the 900,000 receivable were untested, which may contain misstatements as well. So we have to project the misstatement from the 100,000 that we have tested to the rest of 900,000 worth of receivable. And how can we do that? There are different approaches. So we have difference estimation, ratio estimation, and mean per unit. Okay, so depending on the characteristic of the amount or of the transaction that we are testing. Okay, so let's check the application. So we start with difference estimation. So for difference estimation, so we use this for items with book value and audited amount for each item. So we normally use difference estimation when the misstatement is not affected by the book value. Okay, regardless of the book value, the amount of misstatement remain the same. For example, we have noticed that in testing different invoices, the amount of misstatement is always 10 pesos. Okay, so whether the invoice is worth 1,000 pesos or the invoice is worth 10,000 pesos, the amount of misstatement remain to be 10 pesos. In that case, what we will use is difference estimation. Okay? Example. So let's say we are auditing accounts receivable consisting of a 5,000 customer with a total book value of 800,000 pesos. So our audit procedures is confirmation with customer. So let's say out of 5,000 customer, we confirm with 1,000 customer. So this is our sample size. So per book, let's say those 1,000 customers, their receivable is worth 150,000 pesos. And when we confirm the receivable to the 1,000 customer, the total amount that we have gathered is only 145,000 pesos. Okay? So therefore, the average book value of the receivable is 150,000 pesos worth of receivable over 1,000 customers is 150 pesos per customer. Okay? And then the average audited value is 145,000 pesos over 1,000 customers. We have 145 pesos per invoice or per customer rather. So the average misstatement is 150 minus 145 is 5 pesos overstatement per customer. So to project that to population, 5,000 multiplied by the total number of customers, 5,000 units. So the total misstatement would be 25,000 pesos. So our projected audited value is 800,000 less 5 less 25,000 rather. So it should be 25,000. Okay? 800,000 less 25,000, it's 775,000 pesos. Another way to project misstatements to the rest of the population is via ratio estimation. So under ratio estimation, the estimated population error is determined by multiplying the portion of the sample amount misstated multiplied by the total recorded population book value. So this ratio estimation is used if the misstatement in account is proportional to the book value, unlike in difference estimation. So earlier, when we discussed difference estimation, regardless of the amount, the behavior of the misstatement remained to be within a particular range. No? Like for example, if uh, the book value of the item is 1,000 pesos, you observe that the error is, so let's say 5 pesos, then when you examine an account worth 10,000 pesos, the misstatement on that item would still be within that similar range, 5 pesos, for example, then we can use difference estimation. So here, it's if, let's say, the error on or the misstatement on a 1,000 peso item or transaction is, let's say, 100 pesos, and then the misstatement on a 10,000 item is 1,000 pesos, so you can see the misstatement also increased in proportion to the size of the book value. In that case, we will not use difference estimation, but rather ratio estimation. So to illustrate, so let's say the population is still the accounts receivable. So the population, the number of customers in that AR is 5,000 with a total book value of 8,000 pesos, 800,000 pesos. So let's say our procedure is also confirmation. We confirm 1,000 out of 5,000 receivables, and per books, per record of our client, that 1,000 sample selected was worth 150,000 in gross AR, and per confirmation, the confirmed amount is only 145,000 pesos. So if we get the proportion of the book value, of the audited value from the book value, so 145 over 150,000, so 97%. So therefore, somehow the account is 3% misstated. So to get the audited value, we get the total book value 800,000 multiplied by the percentage 97%, and our estimated audited value is 776,000 pesos. So therefore, the estimated misstatement is the difference between 800,000 and 776,000, or 24,000 in this case. So that is the total amount of misstatement. So the misstatement is not only 5,000. So 5,000 is factual misstatement. Okay, but the 24 minus 5,000, so that's 19,000, that is considered as the projected misstatement. So another way is mean per unit. So under mean per unit approach, the auditor is concerned with the audited value rather than the misstatement. So this method is particularly useful if the audited item does not have a recorded value. Okay? So like for example, so let's say similar instance earlier, but this time the amount per books or per record is not available. Okay, earlier we said that the amount per books or per record is 150,000, but this time it's not available. But when we confirm the 1,000 customers, they return the value to be 145,000. And the total number of customers in that AR is 5,000 customers. So we can get the mean per unit of the audited value. So 145,000 divided by 1,000 units or 1,000 customers, we get 145 pesos per unit. This is the average amount of receivable per customer. So we multiply it with the total number of customers, 5,000. So if each customer has an average of 145 receivable, then the total value of receivable must be 725,000 pesos. So as you can see, we are able to arrive at an audited value even if the book value or the recorded value is not available. So this is how we use mean per unit projection. The last one, we have PPS or probability proportional to size sampling. So this is a variable sampling approach which use attribute sampling theory. So in this particular sampling approach, the auditor selects individual pesos and audits the balances, transaction, or document which are considered as logical units that include the individual pesos selected by the auditor for testing. Now, the unique feature of PPS is that the larger the size of the unit, the larger the probability of it being selected for testing. So usually PPS is applicable when we expect few or no errors and when we test for overstatements. So let's have an example of application of PPS or probability proportional to size sampling. So let's apply the concept. Now let's say you are auditing the revenue of a hotel. So which has 5 branches. So branch A, branch B, branch C, branch D, and branch E. Okay? And then you noted that the internal control over the bank is strong or reliable, and you wanted to test for the overstatement in hotel revenues. So let's say the hotel has 5 branches with a different capacity. So we have branch A and B with 50 capacity, C and D with 100 room capacity, and branch E 700 capacity. So the hotel rooms are the ones generating revenue. So that will be your logical units. For A, you assign logical unit of 1 to 50 rooms. For B, 51 to 100 rooms, and so on and so forth until branch E, 301 to 1,000 rooms. So a total of 1,000 rooms population. So that's the total number of rooms of all the hotel branches. And since you're testing for overstatement, it's highly probable or possible that the larger the capacity of the hotel is, the more prone it is to material misstatement or to overstatement of revenue. So that is why you want to select more sample. So when it comes to auditing branch E. And that is possible if you use probability proportional to size. So because this branch has a higher size and therefore higher revenue, then most likely you will be selecting more items from it when you apply the sampling approach. So let's say you selected systematic selection method and you need 20 samples. So to get the interval, you start with the total population 1,000 divided by 20 samples. So the interval is 50. And then we chose as a random start. The random start, let's say, is room 205. So the next sample would be plus 50 interval, room 255. Okay, plus 50 again, room 305, room 355, room 405, and so on and so forth. So when it comes to room 955 plus 50, so that's 1,005. But there is no room 1,005. The room is only up to room 1,000. So therefore, it will restart to room number 5. Then plus 50, room 55. Then plus 50, room 105, so on and so forth until we complete our 20 samples. So as you can see, in this case, the number of samples for branches with smaller capacity is fewer compared to the branch with more capacity. We got more samples in them. Okay, and because of their size, more samples were drawn. So from that branch for our testing. So that's how we apply PPS or probability proportional to size. Because after all, the overstatement most likely occurred to branch E having the most number of room and therefore most number of revenue. So that ends our discussion to audit sampling. Okay, and we'll proceed to our next topic in our next video lecture.